Hey folks, it's Nino. Bear with me, this video is very rough around the edges and very unscripted. I essentially just got done with a squirrel event that was up on Greybrier. We didn't quite make it. We had about 20% health left when he disappeared into the ether. But while Squirrel Boss is difficult, Squirrel Boss is very difficult for sure, but I think I've cracked the code on a strategy that will do what I believe is the primary thing you need to do in that fight, and that is to stay alive. It doesn't really matter your DPS. What matters is the downtime between people dying, and with so many people very frequently dying, you can't contribute that much. I'll explain further in a bit, but the strategy that I found in this past one, I had downtime in the fight where I wasn't able to do anything, but that downtime was minuscule. Like the total amount summed up to about the time of one death walk back to the Squirrel Boss. So overall, really eye-opening to finally sort of understand what was going on in the Squirrel Boss and sort of figure out a strategy that I could use independently or could be applied in a group setting to try and maximize your survivability on that fight. And so I'm just sort of spitballing here. I'm not saying this is what we'll wind up doing, 1 year down the road when we have this boss down, but I think this is a very strong idea to put forward now, and hopefully it'll help at least a few people out. Anyways, I've rambled on enough. In the background, you're gonna see a 34 minute parse where I pulled almost 1 million DPS consistently on Squirrel Boss without dying. 34 minutes alive. That's almost the entire time that Squirrel Boss was up, I was alive. I hadn't died. And I'm gonna tell you how. So Squirrel Boss does two things. He attacks tanks and he spawns squirrel ads. Him attacking the tanks doesn't really kill the raid. It one-shots regular DPS, but it doesn't one-shot tanks. So as long as you keep the tank alive with heals, that mechanic is solved. What does he do with squirrels? With squirrels, he stuns, I'd say about 15-20 people, depending on how many people are there. It seems random, though it might be whoever's closest, but I'm gonna go with random. 15 to 20 people randomly, and then they will be stunned, and after a few seconds they will spawn a squirrel ad. Now that squirrel ad is brutal. It'll one-shot any DPS, any healer, and whenever tanks inevitably get aggro on it, 1 million of them all together are going to completely delete a tank, and then they're gonna go everywhere. That's not really a solvable problem. I think those ads are far, far overtuned, but I don't think Gamigo is going to change that, so we need to work around that strategy. One thing I noticed is that when you spawn a squirrel, they're brought into the world, they are spawned, and they initially don't do anything. They initially aren't aggroed. I don't know if any of you guys have noticed, but whenever a mob respawns in Rift, as long as even if you're like really, really right on it, it won't attack you initially. You have like a brief, I want to say 2-3 seconds before it actually aggroes, and that's the case with these squirrels. So what I found is that what you need to do is essentially play a game of mines. The squirrels are the mines that are placed, it seems like every 30 odd seconds a minute when squirrels respawn, right? And then they'll spawn, and then they'll initially not do anything and stand there, and in that time, you have time to move away from them. And so what I'm thinking is that if you spawn a squirrel, you want to move away from it. You don't have to move far. They have a pretty small aggro radius, but don't underestimate it, but you don't have to move far. You can place yourself pretty comfortably within, I'd say, about 15 meters of a squirrel and not have to worry about anything. They do patrol, but they're very slow, and it's very easy to sort of adjust to that. But essentially what you need to do is you need to look around you. You need to pay attention to what's going on, because squirrels will come up, they'll disappear after like 30 seconds, and then you'll have about 15 seconds of leeway before people are stunned and they spawn again. In that time, you need to find a place away from the squirrels. You need to stand away from the squirrels. The next crucial thing is you need to be in a single target only spec. This is where it gets complicated because, for example, like mages, their best specs often have Firestorm, or their elemental abilities heal allies in the raid, and that means that if one person gets aggro on squirrels, you have aggro on the squirrels. You were placed on the aggro table of the squirrels, and therefore they will target you. Ideally, what you'd want to find is a single target spec that does no cleave, doesn't support the raid at all, it's just pure single target DPS on the boss. And what I've noticed is that, I showed in the video at the very end, but the top people on the parse only target the squirrel boss. They don't DPS anything else. I think the primary problem people are running into is that they're thinking, I see a bunch of ads, let's AoE. What in reality we need to be doing, I think, is avoid the ads. I'm going to go over in a perfect scenario here in a second what I think a really good strategy might be, but essentially you want to completely ignore them, stay away from them, never touch them, never heal anybody, and never try to AoE. Obviously that runs into problems with like rogues and mages, as I mentioned, but if you can find that single target spec that doesn't do any cleave, it's really easy. If you'll notice in the footage in the background, I'm just sort of like paying attention around me, placing myself away from squirrels, and as long as I don't target them, and as long as, you'll see people running in front of me with squirrels chasing them, and as long as I don't get super close to them, I stay away, I don't target them, I don't do anything to them, they can run around me all they want. They won't kill me because I'm not on their aggro table. And as long as I stay off of that, for every squirrel, it's a very easy fight at that point. It's just avoid the squirrel mines and then pew pew the boss. That's great and all, but in a raid setting, it's not easy to sort of strategize like that, and not everybody can apply that. And of course, there's going to be mistakes throughout it. So if you're like a DPS, I think if you want to maximize your uptime, which is what you want to be doing in this fight, you need to employ that strategy to basically keep yourself alive. Do as much damage as you can. Now, in a perfect world, this is like spitballing, super theorizing. I don't think we'd ever be able to apply this unless, it's sort of ingrained and distilled down throughout the entire community that this is what the strategy was. Sort of like how, EOA skips are adopted, where everybody just sort of intrinsically knows where to stand without saying words. We need to like distill it down into the player base before it would be very effective. But what you would do is you would have everybody stack on a single point. All the DPS, the healers, all would stack behind the squirrel boss, and the tank would be in front. And then every 30 seconds or so, when all the squirrels spawn, you have just enough time for everybody to move away far enough. You don't have to go far, just far enough that you don't aggro the squirrels. And then they're basically just over there in a big huddle cluster, and as long as nobody aggroes them or targets them, you don't have to worry about them. So it could become a case of literally just kiting the boss around periodically. Sort of like Murdantics from HK, if y'all remember, he would drop pools and then all the DPS would stack on the back of him. And then we'd all move together as one to avoid taking damage. Sort of applying that same scenario here, I think it would be pretty difficult initially to sort of employ this strategy, but I think that it would lead to the most success. I think it would lead to the most success when fighting Squirrel Boss, because the biggest killer there is the Squirrel ads. The Squirrel ads are, again, in my opinion, completely overtuned, but they're a sort of easy problem to initially stop, but once you have aggro on them, it's nearly impossible to get rid of besides kiting. Alternatively, you could try to have somebody be like a dedicated healer with high movement and purposefully try to get aggro on them and kite them all around, but that would rely on DPS still not pew-pewing them or tanks not getting aggro on them, or at least not a whole bunch of them. But those are essentially two different strategies. I could see spitballing to try and ease the burden of completing Squirrel Boss. That's sort of my harebrained idea. I'd love to try it out, but I don't think we're gonna get anywhere near that amount of coordination outside of a guild raid. And if a bunch of like-minded people got together, purposely spawned it, and tried that strategy, I think it could be very successful. And then eventually, once it's sort of adopted by the player base and sort of just become an unknown thought in the background, hey, Squirrel Boss, you know, we stack up on the butt, we move when people get stunned and Squirrel ads spawn, we don't touch Squirrel ads, done, done, done. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking. I show in the log parse, the log shows like 1.822G damage something or other, and it's just absolutely mind-blowing to see a number that big. Yeah, that's sort of what's on my mind after coming out of that Squirrel Boss. I really just wanted to get my thoughts down and sort of just propose them out on YouTube for people to sort of distill and maybe try and apply themselves. But yeah, that's about it. Folks, hopefully that helps, and if it does, let me know in the comments, and I'll see y'all next time.